Welcome. Hi, my name is Lene Erickson. I am a senior vice president at Third Way, and I work on all things politics. And I'm very happy to have you all here today in a week where really nothing else is going on in Washington. So instead of focusing on the minute-by-minute updates of impeachment news, we're going to talk a little bit today about something I feel even more excited about, which is getting Trump out of the White House in 2020, no matter what happens up on the Hill with impeachment. So we're going to have that conversation from a couple of different angles today. In order to beat Donald Trump, we know that we need to understand what voters think. And we've got a new poll out that I'm going to share some key stats about what voters think in the primary. And then we also have the folks that really understand what's going on in the ground, as I said multiple times to them this morning, in real America. And we know that polls don't actually deliver any electoral votes, so it's important to know what's really happening in the blue wall states like Michigan that are going to deliver the presidency for us. So excited to have those conversations today, and the poll that we are releasing, this is fresh off the presses. It just posted on our website, and it's a quarterly poll of national primary voters. So we've been doing these polls every quarter since the beginning of the year with David Binder Research. It's likely primary voters throughout the country, and this one was fielded from September 19th through the 22nd and has an oversample of African Americans and Latino voters. And what we learned from the poll is that there are a lot of questions still left unanswered, particularly who the nominee is going to be. But there are some things on which Democratic voters are very united, particularly the idea that we need to rerun the 2018 playbook that delivered us victories last time around in order to deliver victories in 2020. So let me talk to you about just a couple of the stats from this poll. So while it might seem to us who watch the polls every day, or to people who do the polls every day, that the race is solidifying, it's actually really not with a lot of Democratic primary voters. A lot of folks are still up in the air. In fact, a quarter of the likely Democratic primary voters say either they don't know or they are for one of the folks that are kind of outside our top tier that we're always talking about here in DC. And of those folks, half of them say they're not going to decide until the weeks before their state's primary. That's a long, long time from now, just to remind you. We have a long ways to go in this race. And we also had a couple of other kind of common wisdom things that we tested with these folks. There's this idea that the party is swinging left. And we asked these likely Democratic primary voters where they would put themselves on an ideological scale. So with 0 being completely liberal, 100 being completely conservative, where would you put yourself? Their answer? 46. They put themselves at a 46. Then we said, where would you put the other candidates in the race? What we saw was that President Obama was exactly in line with the Democratic primary. So you can see it could be, much to folks' chagrin if they start to attack the Obama record, as really Democratic primary voters are still Obama Democrats. They thought Bernie Sanders was, not surprisingly, the furthest to the left. What I thought was interesting is Bernie Sanders is exactly as far away from center by a point as Donald Trump. So if you see kind of the two extremes, that is how the primary voters are thinking about this as well. We also asked, what do you want in a Democratic candidate? There's been a lot of talk about fighting, a lot of talk about, how we're going to go up against Trump. Well, 70% of Democratic primary voters say they care more about a candidate that will unify the country than one that will be fighting for a cause. And 61% say that they would prefer someone who is focused on repairing trust and uniting rather than pushing back on kind of white supremacy and racism that Trump has empowered. So they're really talking about a broad vision for who we need to bring along in 2020. And that's because they think we need a lot of people with us to win in 2020. We asked them, do you think we need to move left in 2020 in order to energize progressives and liberals, or are we going to win by building a broad coalition that includes some people that voted for Trump the first time? And they are decisive. They say we need a broad coalition like we had in 2018 in order to win. We also asked this question about Republican attacks. I hear a lot, it doesn't matter what our nominee supports because Republicans are going to run the attack ads anyways. They're going to call anybody a socialist. They're going to say anybody's for open borders. So we can say whatever we want because they've already got the attack in the can. Well, Democratic primary voters beg to differ. 2/3 of them say it matters that our candidate takes positions that are defensible in the general election. A very, very small proportion say that it doesn't matter, Republicans are going to run that ad anyways. And when we asked about issues, they generally think people are, kind of talking about the right topics, but maybe not in the right way. So we asked this question about whether the 2020 candidates were speaking to you or are they speaking right now to someone else? And Democratic voters were really split. 48% said they're speaking to me, a few fewer said they're speaking to someone else. It's not the kind of numbers I was hoping for, honestly, from likely Democratic primary voters. But there was an interesting thing in the crosstabs, which was when you look at the 1 in 10 voters who post on Twitter daily, 2/3 of them feel like they're being spoken to. They feel like, oh yeah, no, this is the right conversation. Only a third say they're talking to somebody else. And when you look at this very small proportion of Democratic primary voters who call themselves Democratic socialists, they also say, oh yeah, I think I'm being listened to. And the folks who are not Democratic socialists, like the folks who never post on Twitter, they're very mixed about whether they're being spoken to at all. So there's one example in the poll that I'll kind of leave you with about how we think this is playing out, and that's in healthcare. We know healthcare was huge in 2018. It will be in 2020. It's been a big focus of the Democratic conversation in the primary, but perhaps it's not the right focus within the topic of healthcare. So when we asked Democrats what should be the biggest priority of all issues that we should focus on in order to beat Trump, overwhelmingly people said reducing healthcare costs. That's what we ran on in 2018. That's really what they think is going to help deliver victory in 2020, as Trump is very, very underwater on that kind of an issue. Only 16% said we should be prioritizing Medicare for all or single payer. So that's kind of a 30,000-foot view of where Democrats are nationally. They want us to run the 2018 playbook. But as I said, national polls don't deliver a single electoral vote or even a delegate in the primary. So I'm excited to have some smart folks here today who know how to actually do those things. And I'm going to give you very short rundowns of who they are so that we can have lots of conversation, and then I will leave lots of time for questions as well. So right over here to my left, to my far left, we have Lavora Barnes, who's the chair of the Michigan Democratic Party. She was the first person of color elected state party chair in Michigan. She's a longtime veteran political strategist, held many leadership positions throughout the Democratic Party, and importantly, I think for this conversation, was state director for Barack Obama in 2012. So she knows how to win in Michigan in many ways. To her right, we have Brian Stryker. He's a partner at Anzalone List Grove. He manages their Chicago office, and he polled for the successful gubernatorial campaign of Gretchen Whitmer. And he also helped some of those 2018 Dems win in the House. Haley Stevens from Michigan, Cindy Axne from Iowa, and he's really known as kind of the expert on the Midwest. So as a Midwesterner myself, I'm excited to hear what he has to say. And right here to my nearest left, we have Eric Goldman, who was the campaign manager for the fantastic Gretchen Whitmer campaign. He led the strategy and operations there, and he has a lot of information to share about both how they thought about the primary election and then how you get through to the actual general and deliver victory, which is what we're all hoping for. So I'm going to kind of throw it open to you all to just start with kind of your elevator pitch. I'm sure you've been asked, as this is a hot topic of conversation, how to win Michigan. You have delivered turning Michigan around from a horrible disappointment in 2016 to back to a blue wall state in 2018. Just in a couple of words, how did you do it?
You got to show up. This is what I tell everybody. This is what I tell the presidential candidates who are running. If you don't show up in Michigan, if you don't talk to the voters in Michigan, all over Michigan, not just in 3 counties in Southeast Michigan, but the whole state, you're not going to win. The way you win is to talk to voters everywhere in Michigan.
Yeah. Well, I think you got to talk to them about things that they care about too. We'll kind of get into this, but with Gretchen Whitmer, we didn't run a moderate campaign. We didn't run a progressive campaign. We ran talking about things that people cared about, the roads, which is a major sort of state-focused issue that anytime you sit in a focus group and start talking to people about what's going on in Michigan, the first thing they say is, well, the roads are terrible.
Because they are.
Yeah, they're not wrong. We talked about healthcare in a way that was very focused on her life and her experience. We talked about things that mattered in people's lives. And I think that's what you got to do rather than having a sort of policy discussion, have a people discussion.
I agree with both that.
Yeah.
Let's dig in on the issues focus a little bit. People talk about kitchen table issues. Gretchen Whitmer's famous slogan was "Fix the damn roads." But how does that play out in a more nationalized race? Do you think that those same kind of fix the damn roads issues are what people should be focusing on in 2020 to deliver Michigan? Or is there some kind of difference where you can run that in an off year in a gubernatorial race, but in the 2020 campaign, we're going to have to do something different?
So I think, it's sort of impossible to not nationalize a national election. So you sort of have to run a campaign with the dynamics that are playing in a race. But I think that there's no reason why candidates shouldn't be talking about fundamental issues. We talked about infrastructure, roads, also clean drinking water, obviously healthcare. But I think yes and no, but yes. Candidates should be talking about kitchen table issues, things that people care about. And I think Brian said it very well. You don't need to run a progressive campaign or a moderate campaign. You need to run a campaign that's focused on making people's lives better. And I think that that's something that is being lost right now during this primary and by, a number of the candidates who I think are sort of tried to find a lane and in that have sort of maybe, missed the forest for the trees and aren't talking about those issues in a way that I think will resonate with voters in Michigan and across the country.
Are there particular issues, roads, obviously, infrastructure, it's Infrastructure Week here in DC as it has been since the inauguration, but healthcare is one. Are there others that have popped up for you all throughout the campaign or in your conversations on the ground or your polling?
So for me, in Michigan, as I travel the state, still healthcare, still roads, education, right? Folks are still very interested in making sure that we are fully funding programs that protect their kids and get their kids good education. And then more and more, what's popping, frankly, is gun safety. I'm getting a lot of questions about where do we stand as a party on gun safety, and we've actually done a couple of town halls to talk about it, which have brought out large numbers of folks on both sides of the issue, which is always fun. But those issues are starting to pop more. And the thing I think we need to also remember, particularly in Michigan and in the Midwest, because a lot of times I think we think Midwest and we think white. We also need to remember that there are strong urban communities and that we need to be talking about an urban agenda and we need to be talking about race and we need to be having those tough conversations because that's what's on voters' minds.
One issue that we talked about in the campaign too was auto insurance, which has a very racial dynamic in specifically a Detroit dynamic in Michigan. The other thing I would say, Eric mentioned water. I think water is a really tricky issue in Michigan, and it's an example of needing to understand the state and understand the people, because if you walk in and you start talking about Flint and then you walk out, you're getting yourself in a dangerous spot, because once people start feel like you're trying to profit off of something horrible that happened to a bunch of people, particularly communities of color, but people get their backs up. That's a dangerous spot to be. So I think it's very important to have people on the ground, to show up, to actually understand people and not just sort of walk in and talk about an issue that you said, oh, I heard about this on 60 Minutes and it happened in Michigan. Yeah, exactly.
So we heard a lot of talk in 2018 about the suburbs, and Gretchen Whitmer did 7 points better than Hillary Clinton did in the suburbs of Michigan. She won them outright. Do you think that the suburbs are kind of the path to victory in 2020? Has that been overblown? Kind of what do you think that component is?
So I think Michigan is a great example, and you see this in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania too, where you have these high education suburbs, Oakland County, Main Line in Philadelphia, some of the sort of inner ring Allegheny County places in southwestern Pennsylvania, that are shifting pretty strongly to Democrats, places where Whitmer sort of ran it up. You see that in West Michigan as well. But I think that we think of suburbs and we think, Audi, Starbucks, there's a lot of people in Warren who I would say don't drive Audis. First of all, they might key your Audi because it's a foreign car, but there's a lot of blue collar suburbs. There's a lot of racially diverse suburbs, particularly in sort of southern Oakland County, but in other places as well. And I think that those are places Democrats made pretty good gains, right? These sort of Macomb counties of the world where Hillary lost by double digits and then Gretchen Whitmer won it. Obama won it as well pretty handily. I do think the metro areas are where the people are, so they have a big impact on the vote, and the rural areas are getting harder in Michigan and everywhere. But focusing in on some of these Macomb counties of the world, I also think these towns exist all over Pennsylvania and Wisconsin of Jackson, Michigan, or Eau Claire, Wisconsin, or places that had a factory or two. They had some really good jobs. Trump was very good at going to these places and holding a rally in these Daytons of the world, right? And we kind of ignored them for Cleveland and Columbus. And I think that's a huge overlooked piece of where we win this election. Because the high education suburbs in these states, the math does not add up in Michigan if you sort of run it up in Ann Arbor, and that's not enough.
That's exactly right. And the suburbs are where we're going to pick up those vital House seats because, we're 4 away from a House majority, which will give our governor at least one chamber, right? And so a lot of the work that we're doing now is all about reaching into those suburbs, particularly in Oakland County, but like you said, Jackson, Kent, that Grand Rapids area, the changes there, the growth there. We have to do both, though. We have to be able to turn out our Dem base in those urban areas and have those conversations with the suburban and the rural voters, because there's Dems in all those places. So as I say it all the time, we have to walk and chew gum at the same time. You have to do it all.
So how do you do that? How do you walk and chew gum at the same time?
It's hard work.
We're very bad at it in
right.
DC.
But one of the things that we've done is put offices and put people in all of those places all over the state so that there's a base there of hardworking Democrats talking to their neighbors about the issues that matter to them in their neighborhoods. And that sort of builds a base for our candidates to sort of run on. I call it, we're the road, and the candidates come put their car on our road, right? So the party's the road, and we've built that road all over the state. It's a bumpy road because it's Michigan, but it's a road. And if we don't build it everywhere, then we don't get to grow something that helps our candidates actually win top to bottom, north to south, east to west, all over. So that's why we've built it all over.
I think one piece of this too is it's not to sort of keep harping on this thing about talking about issues that people care about, but it's like find things that unify and unite people despite education level, despite urban, suburban, rural. And I think like the things we were talking about were those issues. If you're in the suburb or you're in Detroit, you want to drive on a road that's not going to bust your windshield. You want to have a good school. You want to have clean drinking water when you put a glass of water on the table. Whether you're in Flint or Grand Rapids, you want to know that the water you're putting on your family's dinner table is safe.
The other thing I think that was instructive about the Whitmer campaign, that I think it's very easy in places like this, especially when we don't have a candidate yet, to talk about issues. But people vote for people. I mean, we opened the Whitmer campaign, which was driven by research. We opened the campaign with an ad of her talking about her first job, filling the buffet tables at a Royal Fork, working at a lumber yard, and it communicated a value of hard work. We talked about her being a prosecutor, which communicated toughness to people. They just liked her. I mean, she's just very likable, so they just saw her and immediately sort of liked her. They heard themselves in her. And yeah, for sure. Yeah. which reminds me of, we work for Haley Stevens in Michigan too, and they tried to attack her for being, from Carpetbagger and whatever. Like, did you hear her open her mouth? Yeah, it's like the most Michigan. But there was just a likability to Gretchen where, they threw all these sort of attacks at her, and people were like, that doesn't seem like her. And she's the daughter of CEO of Michigan Blue Cross, right? Could certainly be painted as sort of out of touch and elite, but she's not. And so we did sort of a lot of work early in the campaign telling people who she was. And I think that when you look at Harris's best moment in this primary is when she stood up and sort of told people who she was, right? That busing conversation was about her, very personal. I think that, some of the things that people like about Elizabeth Warren are the sort of conversations about her in Oklahoma. Biden has this about his own tragedy and healthcare story. I mean, when we talked about healthcare for Whitmer, we didn't talk, we'll get into this, I'm sure, but we didn't talk about policy. We talked about the fact that her mom was dying of cancer and she was having to fight the insurance companies while raising kids, and working. And people got that. They heard that and they said, okay, you know where I'm coming from, much more than like some policy paper on healthcare. Right. So I think talking about them about yourself is really important. Obama did that, right? First ad was about paying off his student loans, right? So like, they knew who he was, more than they knew what he stood for, which was really important.
Yeah. So healthcare is obviously one of those topics that there is a wide differentiation of policy opinions within the Democratic Party, but everybody's trying to get to the same goal. But I know from a lot of the 2018 candidates I worked with, they felt very pinched about what they needed to say and how they could deal with it to get through their primary and then to be in a good position to win. How did you all think about that? Were there tough moments that you had to make a decision about how to approach an issue like healthcare where activists might be pushing you to say one specific thing that might necessarily not be about her own personal experience?
So, and for those who don't know the race that well, we had two primary opponents in the Democratic primary who were both for single-payer health care. We never came out for single-payer health care. That wasn't like some genius strategy that we came up with. It was basically Gretchen, and she was running a campaign where she said to us, I don't want to promise things to voters that I can't deliver. And I think that the whole campaign sort of flowed from her vision for the state. And, it was, and, again, we talk about sort of how we message these issues, but it was like, there are certain things to improve people's lives and they shouldn't be partisan, and that's what I'm going to talk about.
If we think we're speaking to voters when we spend 40 minutes on a debate arguing about the intricacies of whose health care plan is better, when frankly for all of the voters it's like, what? I just want health care I can afford. I just want to not have to drive to Canada to get my insulin. We're making a huge mistake. And I think like Brian's point is right. Making it personal and making it about real people and real lives and your life is a bigger deal for the voters than it is whether or not your plan costs $1 billion more than the guy next to you. It's just silly that we spend that kind of time when we've got primetime TV. That's what we spend it on. It's silly.
I mean, I think Eric's point is exactly right. If he would have walked into her office and said, well, 62% of people support this healthcare plan, so you got to be for it, she would have said, go away, right? I'm running a campaign about what, which is what worked about it. But I will say we did focus groups at some point, and we were embroiled in this sort of debate of how do you deal with healthcare, and we walked into a room and sort of, put these ideas in front of people, and they're like, what's single payer?
Yeah,
what is
exactly
that?
right.
I don't know. Is that they're like, oh, it's like a government, like, oh, I don't know. I mean, I don't, they kind of like got into this sort of, do you think people should buy in? And they're like, I don't really know. They just kind of like threw their hands up. They saw downsides and upsides to both. But like the idea that they're sitting around having this considered policy debate about like, whose plan is sort of more, they just want better healthcare.
And I think that goes back to kind of your point, or the poll's point about like people on Twitter who have very strong feelings about which single-payer healthcare plan is better, but like the voters don't, or at least the vast majority of voters don't. They want someone who's going to make sure that they will have care whether they lose their job and that they're not going to go bankrupt, trying to pay for a doctor.
And I mean, Medicare for all to them can mean a buy-in. It can mean free. It can mean whatever. It means to them, oh, everyone has good health care. Like that's what they sort of want, right? They don't judge a plan and say, well, is this Medicare for all? Does it do these 7 things like that?
In fact, when we just did some qualitative on healthcare, when we asked people what does Medicare for all mean, they said healthcare for everyone.
Yeah, right.
We're like, oh, okay, yeah. That's not what we think it means here, but.
Yeah. Same with universal health care. They
Yeah.
don't, like, what is that?
Yeah.
Right? It's health care.
It's healthcare, yeah. You talked about kind of going places that maybe were not visited in 2016.
I mean, Michigan.
Yeah, including the entire state of Michigan, perhaps. I think people have corrected that one now. They got it in their sights for 2020. But even within the state, are there places that Gretchen Whitmer went, people she talked to, kinds of people that really were overlooked in 2016 that you think need to be a big focus in 2020?
So I'll let Eric talk specifically about where the governor traveled. I will say that she traveled the entire state. There is not a corner of the state that she missed, which is an important part of winning a whole state. The other thing I will say is that we ran a slate of candidates who did the same, who sort of followed suit behind her, which I think was a big deal for lifting folks up so that, I don't know if you know, we won everything in 2018. So and a big part of that was Gretchen's leadership in getting out there and getting to every corner of the state and having conversations with all of the voters. And you could see, because she's got a connection with voters, and not everybody has that. So I don't know what to say about how to get a candidate to have that, because you either have it or you don't, right? But the connection that she had with all voters of the state, her ability to sit in a church in Detroit and be comfortable and be happy, and also to be up north and also on the west side of the state. Like, she could go anywhere. This was a candidate you could take anywhere, and she would be comfortable with the voters and having conversations with the voters. So in many ways, Eric's job was easy because his candidate was so amazing. I think that if other candidates are running, they should take lessons from Gretchen Whitmer on how to run and how to work a state, because she did it masterfully.
Yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit more about the campaign in particular?
Yeah, I think, I mean, Lavora set it up pretty well, but Gretchen went everywhere. There's 83 counties in Michigan. Gretchen went to 83 counties in Michigan during the campaign.
The full Grassley, you might say.
Yeah. Yeah, but not how many? I was like 100.
100 and something.
Yeah.
Someone in the audience knows, I'm sure. There you go.
Yeah, exactly. But I think to Lavora's point, she was everywhere, and it was important for her to be seen everywhere and make sure that voters knew that. And from Detroit to the Upper Peninsula, she had an apartment in Detroit, which is about an hour and a half from East Lansing, where she's from. We had a headquarters based in Detroit. And voters there, I think, felt sort of taken for granted over many years, and especially like politicians, especially people running for president, would maybe come in and do a quick stop and then go try to raise some money in the suburbs and then be out. And I think it was important for her to, like Lavora said, I mean, she was in church pretty much every weekend in Detroit, going to community events. It was sort of a hard kind of thing to juggle with this huge state, but making sure that this important voting bloc and this important city felt heard and that she was there. And then, the Upper Peninsula, which is many hours away, there's not a ton of voters there, but it was important for her to be there, including to make at least one stop there in the general election. We had a late primary in August. And so I actually tried to convince her not to go up to
the UP is really far.
It's really far.
It's really far.
It's really far. And kept putting it off until she kept asking and was like, no, we're going there. And then we had to cancel a bunch of stuff and have her go up there for a day in October. But I think that sort of speaks to her commitment to the state and trying to speak to everyone and representing the whole state.
Do you think that's because it sends a message that you are trying to unify
Yes.
and go everywhere, or because it's actual physical proximity?
Look, I mean, it's a state of 9 million people. I think, you can't reach enough
Right.
voters to actually change the election, in any, significant way. If you spent all of your time there meeting voters, yes, it's about sending a message and being everywhere and making sure that people know that, they're being heard and they're being communicated to.
Yeah, I think that when people talk about the Clinton campaign not going to Wisconsin, I could imagine a world where they do a trip and they go to Milwaukee and they go to Madison, and I don't know that helps. In fact, that might hurt as far as people up north and out west thinking, well, yet again, of course we've been forgotten, right? Of course they care about those two places that I don't really like, right? That I sort of like,
that I dislike.
Right,
Yeah,
exactly.
actively.
Right, in the same way of like, if Detroit and the Southeast Michigan and the UP is like, there's a real tension there,
Yeah,
right? I mean, you
absolutely.
see that in Michigan and you see that in Pennsylvania, you see that in a lot of states, right? Sort of between the capital or the larger commercial cities. But I think that like, showing up in places sends a signal that that yes, you care about the entire state, and even if you're not going to get 100% of the vote there, you're going to get some. I mean, I think that's you made a point about rural. I had somebody ask me at some point recently, like, did you know that if we did the same with white rural voters in the Midwest as in Alabama, we would lose every election? And I was like, yes, I definitely know that. Like, that's for sure. We get a third of rural people or more in the Midwest, and that's a really important voting group that people don't seem to grasp that. They think like, oh, rural people, they're all Republicans. Well, like, if they are, then we'll never win an election. Like, so yeah, showing up in those places matters.
Michigan is a state where, as Governor Gretchen Whitmer will have to work and is having to work with Republicans. How did she talk about that during the campaign? How do you navigate that? I know in D.C., talking about what you want to do with Mitch McConnell isn't particularly popular because Mitch McConnell hasn't really wanted to play ball for a while. And yet, when you ask voters, they're like, why don't you get things done? Why don't you work together across party lines? How did you all think about navigating that, and how are you navigating it now?
Well, that's another early ad Obama ran in Iowa. He ran an ad with a Republican state senator from Illinois talking about how he worked across party lines. With Gretchen Whitmer, we ran early advertising about how she worked with the Republican governor, who was hated in many quarters for what he did with Flint and other stuff. It wasn't just that. But was viewed as a murderer. And probably rightfully so. She was talking about how she worked with him to increase the minimum wage and expand Medicaid. And we sometimes explicitly framed it as she was the minority leader of the Senate at the time. She said, it would have been easier politically for me. I could have taken a win by not passing these things and not giving him a victory, but I cared about people who were going to get a raise and get health care, so it was more important. And that's where voters were. I mean, they wanted like, they get that Mitch McConnell is a problem, but they want you to figure out how to work with these folks.
And we talked about that in a Democratic primary.
Yeah. And won every county in the primary.
Was there blowback? Like, did you have protesters outside your office?
I don't think there were any protesters. I would occasionally hear people being like, why is she being nice to Snyder, right? But then, if you just push back and say, listen to what she's saying, right? Listen to what she's saying about working with Snyder and having to, frankly, drag him across the finish line to get something that was good for the people of Michigan. You'll understand why she's having that conversation. I will say that it was fascinating to me, the decision to talk about that in the Democratic primary. Brilliant, by the way. Guys, don't know which of you decided that, but brilliant. But it was all Brian. Because in that primary, running against those two very liberal, guys, that was a really interesting sort of needle to thread, and it worked. People obviously it worked because she crushed them, but it was an interesting thing that maybe I would have had to be convinced to do, Brian. I don't know how hard that was for you to convince.
Nothing great is ever easy, Lavora. I think that there's a specific thing about Michigan, Wisconsin, Iowa, these states that flipped to Trump. There was a shock to the system of Democratic voters, especially in 2017, but I think it's still there. They were unmoored. We all felt that in 2017 and 2018 about what kind of country are we looking at. But you had people walking outside and looking at their neighbors and being like, you're one of the ones, right? And so they got that something had happened, that their state was at the root of it, and that the only way we were going to win is by reaching some of these Trump folks. Like they just like knew that inherently. I think that's especially true in Iowa, where is kind of important. The presidential race is my understanding. But I think that this idea of sort of reaching out to those folks, as you showed in your poll, people want that. People think that's how we win, and they can kind of think of, they can all conceptualize whether it's their neighbor or their cousin or their uncle or whatever, some Republican that voted for Democrats forever. They probably worked for the Ottos, and they're a gun-toting, abortion-hating, Democrat, right? That like voted down the line for D's and then voted for Trump. And so there was a conception of that, and I think that showing that we could work with and reach out to people like that was really important and useful, and it spoke to her values too. I mean, that was the important thing, was that it showed that she put people in front of politics. Like, she didn't care about partisan politics, she cared about helping people, which is what voters want. And it set up very nicely for us in the general as well, when we were running into sort of hardcore pro-Trump guy, and we kind of reached all those voters right in the middle with that exact same message.
And I think one important piece to add to that, and I think this polling sort of shows what we found in Michigan also, which was that like Democratic primary voters weren't, ideologically that different from the people we were communicating with in a general election. Like, they were very similar. I mean, we didn't run a primary campaign and then move to the center in the general election. Like, our message was the same. In fact, I think some of the ads that we ran on TV in the primary, we ended up putting online in the general and running them later as we got closer to the election, and actually maybe even on TV in some media markets. Like, the campaign was the same, and there was almost nothing, I think, different. There was really no ideological shift. And, like Lavora said, we were able to do that and crush our primary opponents, and, sort of never have to pivot. That was not the case for our Republican opponent, who ran this very, like, Trumpy primary campaign and then had to do this shift. And I think it was, like, something that, we started hitting him, he was hitting us, and, like, he just had to come up with a different message and was never really able to do that, and we didn't sort of have to solve that problem.
And I think that that's an important lesson to take away from this campaign, is we won the general and the primary. We were going, if you look at the sort of public polling, and our polling was similar, if you look at the race in March, it was a 2-3 point general election. And then if you look at the race the day we came out of the primary, we were up 10 and never really relinquished that, because we were running, and there was a decision of whether we should conserve resources for November or do them in October or do them in August, and July in the primary. And I think I was pretty forcefully arguing for, spend our money now, we got to win this primary, but also everything we're saying is going to help us in November. And at the same time, he's running these. So I think the idea that we can run a primary campaign and reach out to sort of base Democratic voters and then pivot, it doesn't really work like that. Like, you're on record for all the stuff you said previously. Those TV ads don't just go to primary voters, right. So it's you're talking to everybody, and they're hearing you, and they're judging you, and that's where we won that campaign. We won it in the primary.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, maybe that's the benefit of the more ideologically diverse Democratic coalition, is that, that's not true for Republicans. For Republicans, winning a primary must, at this point at least, look very different than winning a general. And, Tom Tillis and lots of other people are dealing with this problem. But we actually have the benefit of our primary voters looking a heck of a lot more like who we need to assemble to win a general.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that is of the lessons, and there are so many lessons to be learned from how 2018 happened in Michigan and all over the country. But of those lessons, I think this one is the one that our primary candidates could pay the most attention to, which is, let's run a primary race that is a general election race and not a race that is about appealing to the very, very far left of our base, because that is not how we win the general. And you're right, it's not the communications you're doing, your tweets, whatever you're doing, it's not just going to those Dem primary voters. We're all seeing it. Everybody all over the country is seeing it, and we should be running that general election race right now.
Yeah. So Lavora, you've had lots of experiences in Michigan, and there's I'm sure many stories that we won't have time for, but the contrast between kind of the Obama 2012 campaign and then 16 and then 18, which one of those, obviously 16 isn't, but which is the roadmap for winning in 2020? Was the 2012 coalition the same one as 18? Has it shaken up? Which one should we be aiming to reassemble?
The 2018 coalition was broader than the 2012 coalition, and it is, I think, the blueprint for 2020 much more than 2012. 2012, we were running a re-election for a popular president, and we ran in an effort to lift folks all the way up and down the ticket in Michigan, but frankly, very much focused on that top of the ticket. Let's just get this win under our belt, be honest about that. And in 2018, we built a thing designed to not just win the top of the ticket, but actually lift folks up all the way down the ballot, and really did make a difference in Michigan by being able to do that. And that's the way we win in 2020, is that broad coalition across the state, across all demographics, across all segments of the state, rather than that sort of very focused. We were a turnout campaign in many ways in 2012. And 2018 needed to be bigger and broader than that, and it was. In 2020, we'll need that as well.
As y'all went out talking to people, in this new era, Trump era, were there places that seemed easier to approach voters than you thought it might be, places that seemed harder? Were there places that surprised you when the election results actually came in and you thought, oh, that's different than I thought?
They were all hard. I'm just going to be honest about that. They were all hard. I will say that the ability we had to reach voters, I mentioned Kent County before, so this is where Grand Rapids sits, and we had for many years basically ignored this chunk of the state except for the tiny, tiny piece of Grand Rapids that turned out to be Democratic, because we didn't think we had a shot there. And what we learned in 2018, and we will continue to use going forward, is that yes, we have a shot there. Yes, the demographics of that area have changed. Yes, the messages that we're talking about, the issues that we're talking about, resonate with the people of Kent County. And so I think the lesson for me was that there are these parts of the state everywhere, and it's our job as the party to find them everywhere and not just assume that we know, but to actually test and work and figure out what we know about our state, and act on that. And I think that's sort of the big lesson for me from 2018, is that there's work to be done. We just have to make sure we understand and are smart about where we're doing it, and we need data to do that.
Yeah, I think we made decisions to expand what we were doing rather than limit what we were doing pretty much entirely through the campaign, and keep things pretty broad and not sort of, because this was a huge question going into 2018 of, do you sort of recreate the sort of, not the Clinton model, but sort of take take the trends going on and amplify them and sort of go to the high education suburban areas, or do you go to the sort of white working class? You need to boost turnout among people of color, which is primarily African Americans in Michigan, but not entirely. And I think that the answer is we sort of did all those things, and I think that was ultimately pretty effective. When you look at some of the places, Macomb County is pretty iconic. This is a place that is very blue collar, pretty white. Obama won it by a few, Hillary lost it by double digits, and then Gretchen won it by a few. And that's a suburban county. But then at the same time, Oakland County, which both Obama and Hillary won by about 7 or 8, and then Gretchen won by about double that. That's a more high education county. So we didn't really make choices. I guess one thing I was surprised by is how easy it was to beat up on Betsy DeVos, especially in West Michigan. It was like, so
Local hero, Betsy
Grand
DeVos.
Rapids, Dick DeVos, Amway billionaire from Grand Rapids, and Betsy as well. Dick had run for governor in 2006 and gotten beat, but done very well in West Michigan, as it's very Republican historically. And we went straight into the teeth of the DeVosses there to a pretty good effect, right? She's pretty hateable for a lot of reasons. But that was a surprise to me of how easy it was to go at their moneymaker in West Michigan and be like, nah, she's terrible.
She continues to be a moneymaker for us. Our email, literally, our fundraising emails that are about DeVos are the best that we do, because people do not like Betsy DeVos.
I think Brian sort of touched on an important point, which I think circles back to kind of your initial question about the suburbs and if that's the future. And it's really like he was talking about kind of the voters there, and I think that's like the suburbs aren't a monolithic thing, right? The suburbs are diverse, and there's suburbs that are white working class, and there's suburbs that have heavier African American populations or white college educated voters. And ultimately, like, when we're doing these campaigns, we're never thinking about like places. We're not saying we need to win the suburbs or rural or urban. Like, we're thinking about how we win voters. And I think it's like you look at the voters where we're doing better and voters where we're doing worse, and like white men without a college degree are voters that are like drifting pretty quickly away from the Democratic Party. Like college educated women who, maybe voted for John McCain and Mitt Romney are like people who are now up for grabs in this Trump era. That may change when, Trump is out of office, and we'll see if sort of Trumpism lives on. But like, we're always thinking about how do we get these voters to vote for us, not sort of just the suburbs. And then also like, and you sort of see this on like Twitter, from people who don't actually work in Democratic politics or in politics and don't have to actually run these campaigns. It's like, oh, well, we don't need, the rural voters aren't voting for us, so let's focus on these other people. And it's like, no, like, you piece this puzzle together by doing well with everyone, and well with a, white working class voter could be like winning these people by 30-something%, instead of 20-something%. And like, you can build a coalition from all of these kind of diverse groups of voters, and like probably right now the 2018 sort of coalition is more applicable than the 2012, but like it will be different in 2024, and we'll, like, this is always shifting, and I think it's like, how do we put this puzzle together, and it, depends on everything else that's going on.
Yeah. Speaking of everything else that's going on, you may have heard there's some impeachment situation that's happening, an inquiry at least. How would you all, given that Gretchen Whitmer talked about Trump in like almost none of her ads, how would you all advise people who are running outside this town to contend with this massive news story that's going to be taking up our attention for who knows how long, when we're, some people are really, really focused on it, but I would guess a lot of voters in Michigan and elsewhere, it's not the first thing they think about when they wake up in the morning.
Yeah, and we worked on campaigns in California and everywhere, and in the primary, we almost never talked about Trump because Democrats assumed that you don't like Donald Trump, right? And in the general as well, right? And I think I will say we came in late to the John Ossoff campaign. They had already run an ad when we came in early on where he says, "I'm going to be Trump's worst nightmare." I think that was probably fatal to that campaign, that they sort of started off as this like anti-Trump at all costs. And I just think people knew, like, yeah, of course you don't like Donald Trump, you're a Democrat. We already know that. And if you're just going to be one of those Democrats who's just going to go to Washington and hit on Trump all the time, even though we voted for him by, a quarter of a point or whatever it was, that's not what they wanted. And we didn't do that in primaries anywhere either. Look, I think that impeachment is just fast developing. I think that if you're not running for Congress or in Congress, I would probably stay away from it now politically. Certainly if you're in state office. But I think that the broader point of sort of the more time you spend attacking Donald Trump, probably the worse you're doing for yourself, because you're not talking about something that's going to matter in somebody's life.
I think that our candidates, and Brian just touched on this, our candidates need to be telling their story and talking about the issues that they believe in, and giving voters a reason to vote for rather than just a reason to vote against. I will say that there is an important role in doing some accountability on this current president, and I honestly think that's my role at the party more than it is those candidates' roles, and I'm happy to take that on because I enjoy it. But our candidates really do need to be out there telling their story and talking about their issues and having conversations with voters that are not about Donald Trump, but are about the future of our state and about this candidate and what he or she's going to do for our state.
Speaking about what the people care about, let's open it up to questions from the audience. Yeah. Oh, wait 1 second. They're bringing you a microphone, it looks like. For our friends on the live stream, we want to make sure they hear all of your genius words.
Break out into karaoke.
There we go.
So Lavora, you talked about when you're traveling around the States, one of the issues that came up was guns. My question for you is, where is the line on guns? What is too far for a candidate, let's say, in a state like Michigan?
Too far is I'm going to take away your guns. I think that we can all have an intelligent conversation about gun safety, about making sure that gun rights don't extend to people who have criminal histories, people who have mental health issues. We can have all of those conversations in Michigan without folks getting worked up. But folks in Michigan hunt, they have their guns, and if they hear anything that suggests that you're about to come after those guns, you're in trouble. So the conversations really do need to focus on how to make those guns safe and how to keep them out of the hands who shouldn't have them, and how to protect our young folks from the dangers of having those guns in homes, in schools, and in other places.
Other questions?
Hi, my name is Ryo Nakamura, working for Japanese media. I'm interested in how much the president's trade policy affect voters, Michigan voters in 2020. Would that affect the voters to the extent that the Trump supporter might change their opinion and support a Democratic candidate? Thank you.
Trade.
Yeah, and I think that that the idea that there's this conception that Hillary Clinton lost because of NAFTA and because of trade. I don't believe that at all. You just never hear voters talk about it. I think there was a conception when you talk about Trump and the carrier factory in Michigan that he was going to fight for people's jobs. That was a great example of taking one small thing and using it as a story that I'm going to do over and over and over. And when Democrats were sort of laughing at him for, oh, it was only 50 jobs and not 100, like he said, it was like, what are you doing? Like people think he saved their jobs, right? So I think that, but I will also say that people think that the trade war has been a failure, that it has resulted in increased costs on U.S. consumers, that it has hurt farmers, and farmers in Michigan got hit by rain this year in a way that also hurt them because soy is hit by the tariffs, and so they planted more corn, but then the corn got hit by rain. It was more susceptible to sort of late rain. So farmers have been sort of taking it on the chin in Michigan, Iowa, Minnesota, all over the Midwest. And I don't think anybody in Detroit feels like Trump has saved their jobs because of a tariff. So I think there's an opening to talk about it in a way that isn't necessarily I'm pro-globalization, I'm pro sort of free trade at all costs, but Trump has this scattershot approach. It's not working. He's gone too far and been sort of created uncertainty, which has hurt all of us. And especially in Michigan, cars are made of steel, and when you make steel more expensive, you make cars more expensive. And this was something we talked about in the Whitmer campaign. And that's ultimately going to hurt the autos, and it's not going to be good for the autos. And when you're sort of telling a story about somebody being bad for the autos in Michigan, that's not a great place to be. So I do think it will matter, and I think like anything Trump engages in, he makes his position less popular. So I think that people have actually swung from 2016 because of how poorly he's done on the issue.
Other trade thoughts to share?
I will say that the trade issue, particularly as it impacts the autos, is one of the things that we talk about a lot as the party is doing our own version of Trump accountability, because it does resonate with the voters, because they do easily see a connection between that trade policy and jobs in Michigan. And that's an easy connection for us to make that we will continue to make through 2020.
And just one quick thought is, right, like the economy is still pretty strong, and I think that he's actually probably escaped a lot of sort of blame from these policies, that if like the economy does end up slowing down, or not necessarily even in a recession, but I think that like if we're seeing a dip, that voters will place blame from some of these economic policies back to Trump, which I think will be bad for his reelection chances.
Other questions?
Hi, how's it going? My question is, you mentioned in your polls, one of the important things that voters are looking for is someone to unify the country. I mean, that you hear it all the time, whether they believe it or not, and whether they actually want it, it's another question. What I would ask you, with your experience right now, given any candidate in the Republican or Democratic parties, can you give one example of one politician that is acting in a way that has any chance to unify, or that has shown any ability to at least speak without triggering a partisan response? And if not, what would you recommend them doing, or policy or stylistically, in order to try to live up to those and meet those voters' needs? And also, again, kind of adding to that, you mentioned the difference between the Twitter voters and the non-Twitter voters. My kind of background, my family background is non-Twitter voters. And much in line with what you've said, that people don't necessarily have a very deep understanding of it, which is okay. People are focused on their own type of stuff. Now, how well do you think that the current crop of candidates and their styles is meeting those voters? I mean, you showed about 45% for and against, so obviously not too much, but how can they better act to address those voters' needs?
Well, I think we won 30 Trump districts, 31 Trump districts in 2018. You know, we've been talking about Gretchen Whitmer a lot, but I will talk about another great female candidate in Michigan, which when you said we won everything, I assume you're talking about women, because it was all women. And there was, how many conversations did we have in 2017 where people were like, Gretchen's another Hillary Clinton, and it was just because she was a woman. That was it. And she can't win, and the Attorney General, the Secretary of State.
Put a man on that ticket, they said.
Exactly. Haley Stevens, Alyssa Slot, all of it was, you know, they're women. Of course nobody will vote for them because we saw, well, turns out that wasn't right. You know, Haley Stevens started this campaign talking about her work on the auto rescue, talking about how, you know, she was a Michigander who went to D.C. because Michigan was in trouble. With Cindy Axne, who you mentioned in Iowa, her first ad was about her kid. This is before she was an elected official or anything. Go ahead.
Many things about unifying the country, so I think more focused on the national candidates. I know governor's races are not kind of nationalized these days, but in the current crop of presidential candidates,
Yeah.
do you see anyone that's kind of acting in a way that when the election is over, it won't feel like, you know, okay, if my side lost, like there's no one representing anything that I believe in?
Yeah, so I think so Axne talked about pre-K and talked about her own kid and getting, you know, and sort of the school district, there was this inherent unfairness. So everybody has faced this challenge of getting their kid a good education. Everyone in Michigan has been scared that them or their neighborhood or, you know, or their neighbor or their whole region is going to go under because the autos are at risk, Democrat, Republican, whatever. So I think a big part of it is, you know, if you're a prosecutor, everybody worries about crime. Everybody can sort of relate to a situation where, you know, your kid is dying of cancer and, you know, you feel lucky that you have this great healthcare system, even though that's a challenge. I think everyone can pull something out of. We worked in South Dakota, someone who ran for governor who had an accident that left him paralyzed. And there was a personal story about how his faith got him through that, which is, I think faith is a very important piece of this that we forget in rooms like this a lot. And Biden has talked about a little bit. I don't want to get into specific candidates too much, but I think that talking about their lives, talking about who they are, giving people a sense of their shared values. Again, this is exactly what Obama did and he led his campaign with. I think that is so much more important than an issue set of, you know, people getting where you're coming from. And I don't think we hear it enough from any of these candidates. Like, we don't know enough of who these people are. We know that they're senators, they're governors, they're policymakers, but like, what are they? What drives them? What motivates them? And I think that's how you get to people and unify.
Well, don't worry, Tom Steyer is going to be on the next debate stage. So.
Yeah. And
Go ahead,
sorry, I
please.
think just kind of to add to that, and I'm also not going to, you know, select an individual candidate, but I do think that there are a number of candidates who are running who, it's still early, have the potential to do that. And I think, you know, I agree with the things that Brian was saying. It's, you know, telling your story, it's coming across as someone who feels like they're going to fight for you. And I think that there's still time to do that. And look, the hard part is going to be that you're running against Donald Trump, who, like, I mean, is going to do everything he can to divide people and everything he can to sort of make this election us or them. And it's hard to run in an environment that is going to be just incredibly toxic because of who's at the top of the ticket, presumably at the top of the ticket on the Republican side. And, you know, it'll be a challenge for whoever the Democratic nominee is to kind of navigate that.
Other questions?
Hi. I am curious if you guys have seen a strategy to address kind of the issue of identity politics, because in 2016, I think there was such a heavy focus on building coalitions that candidates often did it through siloed approaches, like get Hispanic voters by talking about immigration, get Black voters by talking about police brutality. And I think a lot of voters felt alienated and frustrated by what they saw as identity politics. So I'm wondering if you've seen strategies to unify voters and address those important issues without kind of siloing or pandering to voters based off their grouping.
So the gift that Trump has given us is that he's an equal opportunity hater. So we have all been able to point to all communities, particularly in Michigan as we're having these conversations, and talk about feeling disenfranchised, feeling like other, feeling uncared about, and even feeling unsafe. And that stretches across race and religion and gender and socioeconomic, because it's happening to everybody in this country at this point, except Donald Trump. So that makes it easier for us to build that sort of broader coalition of folks who understand that the threat that this nation is under is a threat to all of us and not just silos of us. So I think that we've broken down many of those silos because Donald Trump has helped us break down those silos. But it's important that our candidates continue to have conversations that are broader and do not do what you just described, which is that sort of, I'm standing in front of this group of people, let me specifically talk about this issue that I think you care about, that I may or may not know anything about, frankly, but I think it's what I'm supposed to talk about because this is what you look like.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, I think that people are people, and like obviously race is important. It's important in politics, but I think that candidates do both themselves and the people they are talking to a huge disservice when they walk into the room and say, "Oh, so you're all Latino, so let's talk about immigration." They're like, "Well, yes, okay, but my kids go to school. I need a job. I need health care, you know." And I think that in Michigan, Flint is the thing that they're like, "Oh, I'm talking to Black people, so I should talk about Flint." It's like, well, yes, Black people do feel more connected to Flint than white people in a lot of places. But the auto insurance issue is one that was very specific around Detroit and is a huge issue. And if you're not paying attention, if you're not talking to people in communities, and you're not going there and showing up and listening, which is the other important point, then you wouldn't know that. You would just know what you saw in 60 Minutes or whatever. So I think like everyone can tell when they're being pandered to. I mean, you can sense it. I mean, you could do the same thing in a rural community. I mean, like, geez, the governor of Illinois would like drop the G's in his words when he went downstate and wear this like stupid vest, and he was like this Chicago hedge fund guy. It's like, who are you fooling? Like, you look like a clown. So like, everybody can sort of suss that out. So I think that's a huge piece of it, of like, rather than figuring of like, how do I pander more effectively, you should just not pander to people and just talk to them as humans.
And just something to sort of add to that, and Brian mentioned Flint, right? He sort of talked about this before. When you do focus groups, excuse me, you are talking to voters and you always kind of set the table. And I think, right, the first question you guys ask is, do you think things are going in the right direction or the wrong direction? People in Michigan at every single focus group, it doesn't matter who it is, they say, well, the roads suck. And then, we were running to succeed Rick Snyder, the Republican governor. You guys would ask, well, what do you think about Rick Snyder? And the one thing that people always brought up, unprompted, after hearing Snyder's name, was Flint. And that doesn't matter if they were Black or white or young or old or male or female. It was a top issue because everybody wants to know that their drinking water's clean. They want to know that they're not going to be able to, or that they're going to be able to afford auto insurance, which is a huge problem in parts of Michigan. And so I think that, the broader point is, like, the things that people care about are actually not that different across like racial or economic or gender lines. Like, people care about kind of these fundamental things, and that when you sort of try to, like you said, sort of talk to people in silos or talk about things in a different way, that's like inherently problematic, and people like Brian and Lavora said, they can tell when they're being pandered to. And if you're sort of have the same message wherever you're going, and it's a message that connects with people, like that's going to work. And then just one last point is, right, like we always sort of obsess, or, people point out that, the Clinton campaign in 2016 lost because of identity politics and they engaged too heavily in identity politics. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not, but like the Republican Party has engaged in identity politics far worse than a Democratic campaign has ever done. Like everything that Donald Trump says is identity politics. And so I think that like, and this goes back to Lavora's point, like a lot of that work is actually done for us because what Donald Trump has done by dividing people is at least uniting our base and uniting a lot of our voters. And that may not be the same in 2024 or in a later election, but I think that will be the case in 2020.
I'll say we just did some qualitative focus groups with African American voters, high and low propensity in key states, and Michigan was one of them. And among young African American men who were low propensity voters, they were like, "It is my duty to vote. I will be there. I don't really know who I'm going to vote for. We'll figure that out later, but I will be there."
Because their mamas told them.
That's right. They got the message.
Exactly.
That's right.
It's true, and it's part of the conversation I have, which I can have from this space where I live, where I am a black woman who is a mama who has said to her boy, "You will vote," right? Like, this is the moment. If there was ever a moment to stand up and be heard, this is it. And one of the mistakes I think we've made cycle after cycle is making every Republican who ran the boogeyman. So it gets harder and harder for us to say but this one's real.
Yeah.
Like, this one is actually the actual boogeyman, and you've watched him do his work now, and it's time to stand up and vote. So this is absolutely what's happening in the black community, is that conversation.
I think a big part of it, I'd be interested in your take on this, but black people get that Trump is a racist, and when he's going after Latinos, and I think you've seen a big shift among African Americans on immigration, where it used to be you would start in a focus group and people would be like, "We got to do something about all these immigrants," right? And that is gone. That has sort of changed. And I think there's an inherent sense, and you see this among Jewish voters, you see this among really any minority group, whether they've been targeted by Trump or not. They're like, we're on this list, like he's coming for us too, right? And like obviously he said a bunch of racist things about black people too, but I think that yes, he has activated a sense that there is an other here, and you're seeing a lot of communities that don't fit in that sort of white Christian straight, rural, gun-toting like community, like sort of react against that of like, I'm on the defensive here, and he's coming after me, and that there's a real fear, and I think it's justified, and that will drive a lot of the stuff that we don't have to do this sort of work.
No, and it's an interesting thing because black people in America aren't surprised by racism, right? We live with that all the time, so it's not a surprise to us that Trump is a racist. But I think that you have just listed a whole bunch of other folks who just went, "Wait a minute. I'm on this list too," right? I thought, and I was angry that it was happening to others, right? But now it's also happening to me, and that's the difference here, is that this is broadened. We've broadened the coalition of folks who are being, it's sad, but being mistreated and being treated like other in this country, and we've got to take that coalition and walk them to the polls in 2020 and take care of this problem. No choice right now, no choice.
We have time for one more question.
So one thing that we haven't talked about a ton is that the Democrats are going to have their nominee on our side of the ticket. And I'm curious what your guys' thoughts are, if it's someone like Warren, for someone like Gary Peters in Michigan, or Tom Tillis in North Carolina, and how the Democrats can win in those down ballot races when there's probably a little bit of space between our nominee and someone on the top of the ticket.
That's a good question. I think one of the things we have learned, the lessons we have learned in Michigan, is to keep our campaigns Michigan focused. So whoever is at that top of the ticket, for us, Gary Peters is the top of the ticket. And we build a race that is built to reelect Gary Peters. And that doesn't mean we don't care about, we don't support, and we don't want the Democratic nominee to win. That will happen because we are focused on making sure that Gary Peters wins. So I think that whoever the Democratic nominee is, our race still looks the same in many ways, because our race is about Gary Peters and everybody that flows beneath him, because that's our goal, is to make sure we get Gary back to the U.S. Senate.
Well, and I think that, again, we won 31 Trump districts or something like that. I think that there are candidates that will perform better or worse in those districts, but I think that the majority of candidates up there will lose a majority of those districts. So I think that to reelect the House majority, to win a Senate seat in Arizona or Georgia or North Carolina, which I think are all very much on the table, we got to be reaching out to Trump voters and to be talking about things that are a little bit less sort of national in whatever state you're in.
So I will ask the final question before I let you all go back to your real lives. After sharing your much wisdom with us, if you had 30 seconds in a room with whoever's going to be our nominee and you got to impart upon them one thing, what would you tell them?
Come to Michigan and pretend like you're Gretchen Whitmer.
That's fair.
Just be a real person and talk to people like you're a person and not a politician. Just be real.
Yeah, I do agree with both those things. I guess to go back, like talk about things that people care about. Talk about making people's lives better.
Well, that is a great little snippet, all in 30 seconds. So we'll package that up and start, running digital ads with it. Yeah, right there. Thank you so much, and I'll ask you all to join me in thanking them.